Welcome to Chapter 20. This is called Strength of a Giant, or America as Hyperpower. So you can see we're actually going to split up this chapter into the two different presidencies and as far as they approach foreign policy. So, of course, Bill Clinton was in office from 1993 until 2001, and then George W. Bush took over. But we'll see actually at the very beginning of this chapter, we're actually looking at sort of the tail end of George Bush Sr., George H.W. Bush. So again, very kind of the end of the 1980s and then 1990s. So some major stuff happened there as well. So you can see here we're looking at this overall snapshot of the post-Cold War era. So a lot of people consider that the Cold War ended in 1989, as you can see here. So we're coming up on that here. So November 9th, 1989, the Berlin Wall collapses. Because you think about it in a lot of ways, that sort of demonstrated that the Soviet Union maybe wasn't as powerful as it previously had been. Otherwise, the idea was, well, they would not have let that happen had they, really tried to hold on to that superpower status. So then the other way of looking at it is when the Soviet Union collapses, right? If we think about the Cold War era being defined by that bipolar, right? So power being at two poles in the world, power distribution at two poles. Well, what happened? Well, the idea is, well, Cold War ended when the one ended. So Soviet Union collapses actually on Christmas Day in 1991, signed itself out of existence. So that huge USSR split up into all those different constituent states, right? So Russia obviously still would be the major player there, but then of course Kazakhstan, Ukraine, all those other countries, right, that made up the Soviet Union. So people looked at that period. So it was just sort of a big question mark. So we had been so remember the Cold War era is thought to have started right at the end of World War II. So 1945 all the way until either the late 90s or sorry late 1980s, early 1990s. So again, that's a long time, many decades, right? That the U.S. foreign policy had been concerned with Cold War tensions and paranoia, all those type of things. So we're looking at, was it unipolarity, hegemony? Again, that would just be more like, say, dominant state or empire. Was the United States then going to seek to sort of dominate others maybe more than it had in the past? So all these other major questions. So again, instead of this sort of U.S.-USSR conflict, would it be, as you can see here, conflict between the North and the South? So of course that means globally. So we often refer to, say, the richer, more developed countries as the global North, and the poor, lesser developed countries as the global South, otherwise known as often the haves and the have-nots, or sort of the West, right, being the United States, Canada, Western Europe, Australia, and so forth, and then the rest. So, there was this sort of sense of optimism at this time, though. Again, instead of global superpower conflict and the threat of nuclear weapons and all these kind of, again, sort of heightened fears and paranoia, there really seemed to be this sort of idea that peace and world order were within reach at that time. Say, hey, this global power conflict is over. Maybe something better is ahead. But of course, that sort of optimism was soon replaced by sort of new fears and challenges, rival challengers, rogue states. So we think about places maybe like North Korea could fall into that category. States maybe not playing by the rules for the international community, pursuing nuclear weapons, those type of things. Also, during this post-Cold War era, we see the rise of non-state actors, or NSA, right? So again, that's any group who obviously is not a state actor. So it could range from a church group, maybe more on the positive end, to more on the negative end, more like a terrorist organization. So Al-Qaeda, of course, could be considered a non-state actor. So then we have these sort of competing dynamics of integration, right? Bringing the world closer together, things like air travel, communications, all those things. The rise of the internet during this period, email, all the social media, of course, towards the end. Then on the other hand, some more fragmentation, right? So kind of the splitting up, or the sort of making things much more local. So you kind of have both of those things going on simultaneously. So again, it sort of led to a lot of fear, a lot of confusion, just a lot of questions at this time period. So again, we have this sort of global versus local. dynamic during this period. So President H.W. Bush spoke of this sort of new world order, although your book does a good job of talking about that maybe he never articulated a perfectly clear, coherent strategy and conception of what that meant. But another observer at the time called this the unipolar moment for the United States. The Soviet Union was done, signed itself out of existence. So this was the time for the United States to really sort of seize that sort of unique moment in its history, that it was the sole superpower left in the world. So we also look at the concept of collective security, of course, sort of strength in numbers. A group of countries banding together to repel an aggressor state, for example, and then of course how the United Nations would fit into this new period. Again, new emphasis on diplomacy. Also we see this in our foreign policy, this idea that spreading democracy could be or benefit our values and of course our interests, but maybe would that somehow bring our foreign policy into conflict with other sort of civilizations and viewpoints. Then on the other hand, we have more local dimensions you can see here, right? So there's this term I want you to be aware of called asymmetric threats. So again, that if you can envision sort of like a table or a scale, I should say, where obviously it's tilted, the one side has much more power, say for example the United States and a group like Al-Qaeda, right? So obviously, say militarily and financially, all that kind of thing, it's not even a contest. The United States dominates that without any question. But so groups like that, again, using say the tools of the greater power, say an airplane flying that into the World Trade Center tower, for example, again that would be an example of an asymmetric threat. Okay, so then of course during this period we see the rise and the spread of more of these sort of ethnic, religious conflicts. So I think this is a great quote from your book. Took the lid off the pot that had been boiling for years. So a lot of these conflicts and other sort of more local challenges that maybe had been suppressed or taken a back seat to things during the Cold War era suddenly boiled over. Then of course during this period we also see the rise of Islamic terrorism, and of course we can see that that's carried on to the present day. All right, so again, during this period, so the post-Cold War world, a lot of people look at new constitutional order, sort of meaning a new sort of framework for what the global order was going to be. So again, rise of collective security. So we'll look at the first Gulf War as sort of a textbook example of that in the next slide here, or next slides. All right, so use of peacekeeping. So again, that would be more to keep sides that have agreed to cease conflict, keep them apart, or peace enforcement, more where the idea that the United Nations and other groups would come in and actually sort of enforce a peace between the two. So again, it's a very similar concepts, but maybe peace enforcement you could think of as a little bit more of a stronger thing, right? Where the warring parties have not exactly agreed themselves to stop yet. All right, search for diplomatic solutions as well. So again, this would be sort of more related to the liberal perspective of international relations. A lot of people would look at sort of what about the failure of institutions and diplomacy to resolve conflicts in this post-Cold War world. Again, it might sound nice to resolve things through negotiations and diplomacy, but the realist perspective, for example, would say, well, that was a fool's errand, and that should not have been the prevalent strategy. So again, kind of looking at those questions like global or regional solutions, which do you find better? And of course, we're still asking some of those questions today. So again, returning to collective security here, as I said, the Gulf War, we think about it's called the Persian Gulf War, or the first Gulf War today. Again, people say is a sort of a textbook example of that collective security. So if you see what happens, right? So again, we have this aggressor state, Iraq, invades Kuwait, a much tinier country right on its border there, in August of 1990. So the UN takes quick action. The Security Council unanimously passes Resolution 660, saying Iraq has to withdraw from Kuwait. All right, so there's some other resolutions as well, but the United Nations did say that was a violation of Kuwait's sovereignty, and that should obviously not have happened. So UN members built up a military presence, right? So you can see there was actually two different operations here. So Desert Shield is the idea that it would prevent more Iraqi expansion. So, if you kind of remember from the earlier part of the course, that would, of course, relate more to the concept of containment. Again, prevent Saddam Hussein and Iraq from going any further. And then Desert Storm would be going a little farther, more the rollback idea, repel Iraq from Kuwait. Again, you can see there. So they had moved into Kuwait. So the first operation was to stop them from going any further, and then Desert Storm obviously the idea would be to push them back to where they were before. Okay, so the UN authorized members to use all necessary means. Sometimes we look at these things and, well, what exactly does that mean? So obviously that was going to be necessitate military force. Okay, so we see Desert Storm, January 1991. So you see a few months here after the invasion happened. It wasn't like it happened the next week or something, but of course it takes a while to get something like this going. But you can see it happened fairly quickly, right? So by just a few weeks later, Iraq is repelled from Kuwait in February there. So it wasn't like this was a long drawn out conflict by any means. So things really, people looked at this as, hey, this collective security stuff really can work. If a whole bunch of countries sort of band together and try to repel this aggressor state, hey, that you could see that really did happen fairly quickly. Okay, so looking at the United States in this era. So this is a good quote from your book here. The United States enjoyed a degree of world hegemony beyond George Washington's most extravagant dreams. So again, going back, remember he takes office way back in 1789. So the United States, during that period was by no means, having a degree of world hegemony, right? So the United States foreign policy has obviously changed dramatically during that time. Okay, so we mentioned that idea of unipolarity versus hegemony. So this is maybe more of a kind of a standard definition here for hegemony. So leadership or predominant influence exercised by one nation over others, right? So maybe that's a little different than empire. You could see where instead of being a leader or influencing, where empire might be more trying to dominate, trying to keep all those other countries under your thumb. All right, so it's a little bit of what we say a paradoxical position for the United States, right? So you can see in some ways that's great to be the sole superpower, but the United States soon finds itself sort of criticized in a lot of ways as people say, well, the United States is trying to be the world's policeman. Sort of the idea that anytime an issue comes up, the United States is going to be the one expected to get involved there. All right, because of these kind of things, right? High-tech military, a robust computer-driven economy, and the United States also has a lot of what we call soft power attributes, or this idea of power through attraction rather than coercion. So through coercion or force would be called more hard power, of course. So if you compare that to, or contrast that, I should say, with a country like China, where maybe they don't have quite that same power through attraction. Right, China, for example, is not sort of known throughout the world, say with entertainment and values, those type of things, anywhere near the same way the United States would be. So speaking about some of those soft power attributes, so say something like Michael Jordan, just how global of an athlete he became. Right, so your book refers to it as the first great athlete of the wired world. Again, with the growth of the internet and all that. 1992 Olympic Games, where the United States had the dream team and everything. So if you click on this link, it'll take you to the NBA's global website. So again, it'll show you how many players, are on NBA rosters today. How that's grown incredibly. So it's in the triple digits now. Games broadcast across the world. So we have this idea of American popular culture sort of become almost like a language for the world, like global lingua franca, is a lot of people called it. Now, of course, your book refers to this and talks a little bit about how for a lot of places kind of rejected this a little bit because they saw, the sort of Americanization of things instead of just globalization. They saw it as Americanization, right? So then this would be a definition of globalization that you can use. All right, so we'll go ahead and end this first video here, and we'll pick up in the next.